On the evening of November 11, 1692, within a modest meeting house located in the northern portion of Essex County, Massachusetts, a Puritan minister ascended to the pulpit. He delivered a sermon of such profound terror that, before the sun could rise, 3 members of his congregation lay dead. The text of that sermon, bound in plain calfskin, was secured within an iron chest, hidden beneath the pulpit, and interred within the meeting house's foundation, when the structure was demolished in 1784. For close to 150 years, those villagers who were aware of the story refused to speak of it above a murmur. They referred to it only as the Night Discourse, and they held the firm belief that any individual who recited the minister's words aloud would not survive to witness the following dawn. What follows is a complete account of that sermon, the man who composed it, and the 7 deaths that no court within Massachusetts ever dared to examine. Before we proceed with the narrative of Reverend Josiah Harkwell and the settlement of Wrentham Crossing, kindly subscribe to the channel and leave a comment indicating your state or country of origin. Your engagement is more helpful than you might realize, and it enables narratives such as this one to find their way to those who ought to hear them. Let us now return to the autumn of 1692, to a region of the Bay Colony where the Salem witch trials represented merely the commencement of the dread. Wrentham Crossing was not a substantial settlement, even by the standards of the Massachusetts frontier. It was situated in a shallow valley, approximately 11 miles inland from the coast, nestled between the Merrimack River and the wooded highlands that ascended toward the New Hampshire border. Fewer than 90 families resided there during that autumn of 1692. The majority were Congregationalists who had arrived in the second wave of Puritan migration roughly 30 years earlier. The village was distinguished by 3 attributes. It produced excellent hard cider from a notably large orchard established by its founder, a man named Ebenezer Treadaway. It possessed one of the oldest meeting houses in the northern part of the colony, constructed of hand-hewn oak timbers and dark fieldstone, and it was, as per the magistrates in Ipswich, one of the quietest and most orderly settlements in the entire region. There were no altercations, no drunkenness, no public disputes among neighbors. The village was governed by a committee of 7 elders, all men of moderate wealth and strict religious observance. The pulpit of the meeting house had been held for the previous 23 years by a single minister, the Reverend Josiah Harkwell. Harkwell was 58 years old during that autumn of the trials. He had come to Wrentham Crossing as a young man from Boston, where he had been a student of the Reverend Increase Mather. His congregation regarded him as a man of profound learning, severe disposition, and unwavering faith. He was tall and slender, with gray hair drawn back into a tight queue. He preached with a quiet intensity that never escalated into theatrical rage. The villagers respected him, though few held affection for him. He had never wed. He lived alone in the small parsonage behind the meeting house, with a single housekeeper, a widow named Prudence Dolliver, who had managed his household for over a decade. Harkwell's sermons were transcribed each week by one of the elders and bound into leather volumes stored in the parsonage cellar. By 1692, nearly 200 of these sermons had been preserved. Every one of them had been delivered. Every one of them, that is, except the final one. To comprehend the events of that November, one must first understand the atmosphere that pervaded all of New England in the months preceding them. The summer of 1692 had been unusually hot along the coast. The spring rains had been insufficient. The corn was sparse, and the apple harvest was delayed. A measles outbreak had claimed the lives of 11 children in the nearby town of Rowley. The Penobscot and Abenaki, pressured by northern conflicts and the ongoing strife with New France, had been raiding the frontier settlements of Maine with greater audacity than at any time in living memory. Refugees from these raids had begun to drift southward through the Bay Colony, bringing with them tales of burned villages and captives taken into the woods. Sermons preached in the surrounding towns almost uniformly took up themes of hidden sin, unseen judgment, and the fragility of the barrier between the visible world and what was termed the invisible. It was a season in which people listened to the creaking of their own houses at night with the vigilance of prey. In Salem village, less than 20 miles south of Wrentham Crossing, the witch trials had been underway since the previous winter. By October, 19 individuals had been hanged on Gallows Hill. One elderly man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death beneath a pile of stones for refusing to enter a plea. More than 150 accused persons were held in jails at Ipswich, Cambridge, and Boston, awaiting trials that might or might not ever occur. The hysteria had radiated outward from Salem in concentric circles of suspicion. Even in quiet Wrentham Crossing, neighbors who had known one another for decades began to regard each other with new and uneasy suspicion. Women who had always lived alone suddenly became subjects of gossip. Old disagreements over fence lines assumed the character of spiritual conflict. Children who had once played freely in the commons were kept indoors by their parents. Every sick cow, every cream that failed to churn, every headache that persisted more than a day was quietly scrutinized for signs of the adversary. The initial indication that something was amiss in the village came in the last week of September. A young woman named Abigail Ruddock, 19 years old and recently married to the blacksmith's son, began to suffer from what her mother described as fits of the falling sickness. She would collapse without warning, her body rigid, her eyes rolled back, her mouth foaming. Upon recovery, she remembered nothing. The village physician, a man named Dr. Hiram Wentfield, could identify no physical cause. Within 10 days, 4 other young women in the village were afflicted with the same condition. They were Hannah Cordwell, the miller's daughter, Sarah Brimsby, a servant in the household of Elder Penhallow, Rebecca Dowd, a widow of 23 who lived with her mother-in-law, and Mary Treadway, a great-granddaughter of the village's founder. The elders met in secret and agreed that the matter should be handled quietly, without summoning the magistrates from Ipswich, for none of them wished to bring the Salem madness upon their own heads. They had observed what transpired in villages that called in the magistrates. They had watched Andover fall apart over the course of a summer. They had no desire to be next. Reverend Harkwell was asked to visit each of the afflicted women and pray over them. He complied. He reported to the elders that he had found no evidence of diabolical possession. He suggested that the fits were the result of poor diet, bad air, and the general disturbance of the times. The elders accepted his judgment with relief, but Harkwell himself did not accept it. In his private journal, which survives in a single fragment in the archives of the Essex Historical Society, he wrote that on the evening of October the 29th, he had witnessed something in the woods behind the parsonage that he could not explain, and that it had filled him with a cold and growing dread. The fragment of the journal is worth quoting in his precise words, for it is the only direct testimony we possess from the man himself before the night of the sermon. He wrote that he had been walking along the path behind the orchard, as he often did at dusk, when he came to the stone wall marking the boundary between the village land and the old Treadway woodlot. There, he saw, standing among the trees about 40 yards distant, a figure that appeared to be a woman in a dark gray dress, facing away from him, utterly motionless. He called out. The figure did not move. He walked closer. As he did so, he saw that the figure was not a woman, but a bundle of cloth hung from a low branch, arranged in the rough shape of a human form. When he approached within 10 feet, he realized that the cloth bundle had been tied there recently, for the knots were fresh and the fabric still bore the sharp smell of the wool room, as though it had been pulled from a loom only hours before. Pinned to the cloth with a dull iron nail was a piece of folded paper. On the paper, written in a hand he did not recognize, was a list of 7 names. His own name was fourth on the list. The first 3 names were Abigail Ruddock, Prudence Dolliver, and Mercy Lewiscombe. Mercy Lewiscombe was the name of his housekeeper's 7-year-old granddaughter, who lived in the parsonage with the widow Dolliver. The 4th name was Josiah Harkwell. The 5th, 6th, and 7th names were left blank. Harkwell removed the paper from the cloth bundle, returned to the parsonage, and locked it inside his writing desk. He did not tell the elders. He did not tell the widow Dolliver. In his journal, he wrote only that he had seen a sign of the adversary, and that he intended to address the matter from the pulpit on the next Lord's Day. But the next Lord's Day came and went, and he preached his ordinary sermon on the book of Jeremiah, and the list remained locked in the desk. Over the following 2 weeks, 2 of the 3 named women fell gravely ill. Abigail Ruddock's fits grew worse. The widow Dolliver, who had been in perfect health, began to cough blood into her handkerchief in the small hours of the morning, always between 200 and 300, always in short bursts of 3 or 4 coughs that left her too weak to rise. The child, Mercy Lewiscombe, began to speak of dreams in which a tall man without a face stood at the foot of her bed and pointed at her chest. She woke from these dreams with her small hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails broke the skin of her palms. On the morning of November the 10th, 1692, Reverend Harkwell sent word to the 7 elders that he would preach a special sermon the following evening at the midweek service, and that every adult member of the congregation was to attend. He did not tell them the subject. He asked only that they bring candles, for the sermon would be given after sundown. He also asked, in a note that several of the elders later remembered as being strangely urgent, that no one be permitted to remain outside the meeting house during the sermon. The doors were to be barred from within. Whatever was said inside would be heard only by those who'd been called to hear it. The meeting house at Wrentham Crossing on the night of November the 11th was filled beyond its ordinary capacity. Roughly 140 adults crowded into the pews and the back gallery. The windows had been shuttered against the cold, and the only light came from the tallow candles each congregant had brought, and from a single whale oil lamp burning on the pulpit. A light snow had begun to fall outside, the first of the season, and the wind moved through the gaps in the shingles with a low, intermittent moan that several witnesses later described as sounding almost like a human voice. The smell of the room was a familiar one to every person in it. The smell of cold oak and hot tallow and the damp wool of coats hung over pew rails. But under those familiar smells, there was said to be something else that night, a faint and sickly sweetness that some compared to the smell of an unopened springhouse, and others to the smell of rotting apples. No one could find its source. Reverend Harkwell climbed into the pulpit at precisely 700. He was carrying a leather-bound manuscript, which he placed on the lectern. He looked older than he had looked the week before. His face had grown thin in a way that the congregation had not noticed during the bustle of arrival, and his hands trembled when he opened the book. He did not begin with a prayer. He did not begin with a reading of a scripture. He began by reading out a list of 7 names: Abigail Ruddock, Prudence Dolliver, Mercy Lewiscombe, Josiah Harkwell, Silas Ruddock, Thomas Penhallow, Ebenezer Hortrick. When he finished reading the names, he closed the book, and, in the silence that followed, one of the elders, a man named Silas Ruddock, who was the father of the afflicted Abigail, rose to his feet and demanded to know why his own name had been spoken aloud. Harkwell did not answer him. He opened the book again and began to preach. Let me pause the story here for just a moment. If you are finding this account as unsettling as I am, I want to ask you to hit the like button below this video, because it genuinely helps these hidden corners of American history reach people who would otherwise never hear them. And if you have ever wondered what really happened in the smaller Puritan villages during the autumn of 1692, outside the better-known trials at Salem, leave a comment and tell me your theory about what Reverend Harkwell truly saw in those woods. I read every comment, and some of the best ideas for future stories come from you. Now, let us return to the meeting house at Wrentham Crossing, and to the sermon that no one there would ever forget. The manuscript of the sermon, which was recovered more than 2 centuries later under circumstances we will come to presently, runs to some 14 zalozend words and is divided into 3 long movements. The first movement Harkwell titled, in his own hand, On the Covenant of Silence. In it, he argued that the village of Wrentham Crossing had been built upon a sin that had never been confessed. He reminded the congregation that the village had been founded in 1661 by Ebenezer Treadaway, and that the land upon which the meeting house stood had not been purchased from the Pennacook people, who had lived there for centuries before. It had been taken by force during a brief and undocumented skirmish in 1663, in which Treadaway and a small party of settlers had killed 11 Pennacook men, women, and children, burned their wigwams, and thrown their bodies into a sinkhole about a mile north of the village. The survivors had been driven into the forest. The sinkhole had been filled with stones and covered with earth, and over it, the settlers had planted the great orchard that was now the pride of the village. Every apple pressed into cider in Wrentham Crossing, Harkwell told the congregation that night, had grown from soil fed by the bones of murdered people. He said this not as accusation, but as fact. He named the 4 surviving perpetrators of the killing, 2 of whom were the grandfathers of men who sat that very evening in the pews before him. He described the weather on the day of the skirmish, a cold and gray afternoon in late October of 1663, with the first dusting of snow already on the high branches. He described the sound the wigwams had made when they burned, a sound like the drawing in of a great breath. He described the manner in which 3 of the Pennacook children had been struck down while they ran. He described the way one of the women, a mother of 2 of those children, had not run, but had stood her ground with a short flint blade in her hand, and had been cut down last. He said he did not know how he knew these details. He said they had come to him in the nights since October the 29th, in dreams that were not his own. He said the covenant of silence, which had been kept by the village for 29 years, had begun to break. He said the afflictions of the young women were not witchcraft. They were not the work of the devil. They were the first stirrings of a judgment that had been long delayed, a judgment that was not theological, but historical, not supernatural, but moral. And he said, in a voice that was recorded by 3 separate witnesses as being terribly calm, that the judgment would not stop with the women. The judgment would come for all of them. He knew this because he had been given the list. He said the list had not been placed in woods by the adversary. It had been placed there by the hand of someone who remembered. He did not know who. He suspected, but he did not know. He said that what he did know was that the list could not be unspoken. The names, once read aloud in the presence of the congregation, could not be taken back. The door of the meeting house, he reminded them, was barred from within. No one was leaving that room until he had finished. The second movement of the sermon Harkwell titled On the Voice from the Orchard. Here he described, in plain and unadorned language, what he had seen and heard in the weeks leading up to the sermon. He described the figure in the woods. He described the paper with the 7 names. He then described something he had not written in his journal, which was that on 3 separate nights in October, he had been awakened by a voice speaking to him from beneath the floorboards of the parsonage. The voice had not been loud. It had been, he said, like the voice of a man speaking into a well from some distance above, coming up thin and hollow from below the feet of his bed. The voice had spoken in a language he did not recognize, but which he believed. On the basis of his reading of the accounts of John Eliot among the native peoples, to be a dialect of Eastern Algonquian. The voice had said the same short phrase each time, repeating it slowly 3 times on each of the 3 nights, and then falling silent. On the 3rd night, Harkwell had lit a taper, knelt on the floor of his bedroom, and written the phrase down phonetically as he heard it. He read the phrase aloud to the congregation. Several witnesses later agreed on its approximate sound. It was recorded by Elder Thomas Penhallow, who sat in the front pew, as something close to Kiatanit Nipuwitimak. Harkwell said he did not know the meaning. He said he had sent a letter inquiring about the phrase to a man in Natick, who was known to speak the native tongues. A half-converted Nip named Joseph Quanapahit, who had served as a scout for the English during King Philip's War, and was one of the few men still living who could read and write in his own language. Quanapahit had written back. His letter was brief. He refused to translate the phrase. He warned Harkwell to burn the paper on which it was written, to speak the words to no one, and to make no further inquiry. The letter closed with a single line that Harkwell read aloud to the congregation. Quanapahit had written in plain English that some debts do not grow smaller with time, and that the man to whom the words had been spoken should begin at once to put his house in order. Harkwell had not burned the paper. He had not put his house in order in the manner Quanapahit had meant. He had instead spoken the words to the congregation that night, and he said that he believed now, in the light of all that had happened, that the voice beneath the floorboards was the voice of a Pennacook powwow, a medicine man who had been buried alive during the killing of 1663, and whose bones lay somewhere beneath the parsonage foundation. Several members of the congregation began to weep at this point in the sermon. Others cried out in protest. An elder named Caleb Merriwell called out for the minister to stop, to come down from the pulpit, to cease before he did greater damage. Harkwell did not stop. He continued. Elder Penhallow later testified that when the minister spoke the phrase aloud, every candle in the meeting house guttered, simultaneously, as though a wind had passed through the shuttered room, although no wind could be felt on the skin. The whale oil lamp on the pulpit, Penhallow said, dimmed to the color of an old bruise, and then slowly returned to its normal brightness. And in the moment of that dimming, the shadows on the walls behind the pulpit did not move in the direction the lamp had shifted. They moved, he said, in the other direction. He admitted in his testimony that he might have been mistaken. He said he had been looking at the minister's face, and that his eyes had not been steady upon the shadows. But he said he would swear on the Bible that the shadows had not behaved as shadows ought to behave. The third movement of the sermon was the shortest, and it was the one that the survivors remembered most clearly, because they believed for the rest of their lives that it was the one that had killed the 3 who died before dawn. Harkwell titled it On the Breaking of the Seven. He said that he had come to understand that the list of 7 names was not a list of victims. It was a list of those who were required to confess. 4 of the 7, he said, were descendants of the men who had carried out the killing in 1663, and 3 were the silent accomplices across the generations who had inherited the land and the orchard, and the prophets and the silence. The afflictions of Abigail Ruddock, the sickness of Prudence Dolliver, the dreams of the child Mercy Lewiscombe, and his own growing dread were the first 4 breakings. The other 3, he said, would come tonight. They could not be stopped. They could only be witnessed. Toward the hand of God sore. He turned to Silas Ruddock in the front pew and asked him by name whether he knew what his grandfather, Jonas Ruddock, had done in 1663. Silas Ruddock did not answer. His face, witnesses said, had gone the color of unbaked bread. Tor you stand Fortra Harkwell turned to Thomas Penhale and asked him the same question about his grandfather, Obadiah Penhale. Penhale did not answer. Harkwell turned to Ebenezer Cotterill, the youngest of the elders, and asked him what his great-uncle Hezekiah had confessed to the minister on his deathbed in 1679. Cotterill did not answer. A woman in the back of the meeting house, the wife of Cotterill, began to weep openly. And one of the deacons moved to comfort her, but did not speak. Harkwell closed the book. He looked out over the congregation. He said only 4 words. He said, "The debt is due." What happened in the next several minutes was described differently by almost every witness who survived. The most consistent account, assembled from the testimony of 23 congregants gathered in the days afterward by the visiting Reverend Nathaniel Saltonstall of Ipswich, is as follows. The candles in the meeting house began to flicker again, but this time several of them went out entirely. Witnesses later counted them. Of the roughly 140 candles that had been burning at the start of the sermon, no fewer than 31 had gone out, and the pattern of their extinguishment seemed to form a rough circle around the 3 elders named at the end of the sermon. A low sound, which some described as a hum and others as a distant drumming, filled the room. 2 witnesses said it sounded like something heard through the wall of a neighboring house. One said it sounded like a herd of slow horses walking somewhere underneath the floor. The wife of Elder Penhallow, who sat directly behind her husband, later said that she had felt a cold breath of air pass across the back of her neck at that moment, as though a door had been opened and closed behind her. Although the door of the meeting house was still barred, and no one was standing behind her, the blacksmith, a man named Obed Scolthwaite, said he had looked down at his own hands and had seen that the hair on his knuckles was standing straight up in the way that hair stands up in the minutes before a lightning strike. Though no storm was within miles. Abigail Ruddock, who was present in the congregation and had been sitting between her mother and her husband, rose to her feet and walked forward to the pulpit. She did not speak. She stood before Reverend Harkwell. Her eyes, witnesses said, were clear and calm for the first time in weeks. She raised one hand and pointed at her own father, Silas Ruddock, in the front pew. Silas Ruddock stood up, clutched at his chest, and collapsed. He was dead before anyone could reach him. At almost the same moment, Thomas Penhallow in the second pew let out a strangled cry and fell forward onto his hands and knees. He vomited a quantity of dark blood onto the floorboards, tried to rise, and collapsed fully. He, too, was dead within moments. "Chor, please. Open the door." Chor Ebenezer Cotterill ran from the meeting house. The door had been unbarred by a frightened deacon in the moment of the first death. Cotterill was found the next morning in the orchard, face down in the snow, about 30 ft from the old sinkhole. He had not been struck. He had not bled. He had, according to Dr. Winfield's examination, simply stopped breathing in the manner of a man whose body had decided, without consultation with any physical cause, to cease its work. The three men whose great-uncles and grandfathers had killed the Pennacook in 1663 were all dead before the sun rose on November the 12th, 1692. The story could have ended there. In a different time, in a different place, it might have become public. It might have been investigated by the magistrates at Ipswich, or reported to Boston, or written about in the Mather family's voluminous records of providential and preternatural occurrences in New England. But the autumn of 1692 was not an ordinary autumn. The witch trials at Salem had just collapsed in scandal. The governor, Sir William Phipps, had dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October the 29th, less than 2 weeks before the sermon at Wrentham Crossing. He had done so because his own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, had been accused by one of the afflicted girls, and he had suddenly discovered, in the midst of that personal crisis, that the spectral evidence upon which the court had based most of its convictions was worthless. The colony was exhausted, ashamed, and deeply frightened of any new outbreak of supernatural rumor. The Mathers were under quiet attack for having endorsed the trials. The magistrates in Ipswich were being asked difficult questions about their own conduct. No one in the higher circles of colonial government had any appetite whatsoever for the news that 3 prominent men of a quiet village in Essex County had died in a single night during the preaching of a sermon that named a buried atrocity and a Pennacook medicine man speaking from beneath a parsonage floor. The elders of Wrentham Crossing, of whom 3 were now dead and the remaining 4 were terrified, made a collective decision. They met at dawn on November the 12th, while the bodies of Ruddock, Penhallow, and Cotterick still lay uncovered in the meeting house, covered only with plain linen cloths. They swore an oath of silence. They agreed that the 3 dead men had suffered natural attacks of apoplexy, brought on by the stress of the season. They agreed that the sermon would be described, if described at all, as an ordinary exhortation to repentance. They agreed that the manuscript of the sermon would be hidden. They agreed that the private journal of Reverend Harkwell would be destroyed, although in the event it was only partially destroyed, a single fragment escaping the fire in the parsonage hearth. They agreed that the letter from Joseph Quanapawit would be burned in its entirety, which it was, and they agreed that Reverend Josiah Harkwell would be sent away. Harkwell did not resist. He handed over the manuscript to the senior surviving elder, a man named Caleb Merriweather, on the condition that it be preserved and not destroyed. Merriweather had the manuscript bound in a plain calfskin cover, placed inside a small iron box, and locked with a key that he alone kept. The box was set into a cavity beneath the pulpit itself, and the floorboards were replaced over it. Harkwell left Wrentham Crossing on November the 17th, 1692, carrying only a small wooden chest and a single horse. He did not return to Boston. He did not go to any other settlement in the colony. According to one letter preserved in the Saltonstall family papers, he was seen riding northwest into the woods, toward the old Pennacook territories along the Merrimack, and he was never seen again by any Englishman in the Bay Colony. The villagers of Wrentham Crossing kept their oath. The afflictions of Abigail Ruddock ceased within a week. The widow Dolliver recovered from her cough by the new year. The child Mercy Linscomb grew up to marry a cooper from Haverhill, and lived into her 80s without ever, according to her own descendants, speaking a single word about the events of that November. The orchard continued to produce cider, though it was noted by later generations that the cider of Wrentham Crossing, after 1692, had a slightly different flavor than the cider of Wrentham Crossing before. Some said it was sweeter. Some said it was bitter at the back of the tongue. The meeting house continued to hold Sunday services under a new minister sent from Cambridge, a young man named the Reverend Jonathan Falsworth, who was told nothing of what had happened, and who preached for 32 years without ever, as far as anyone knew, suspecting that he was preaching from a pulpit set over an iron box set over the confession that had killed 3 men, and the iron box beneath the pulpit remained locked for 92 years. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Wrentham Crossing intensifies in ways that the original 7 elders could never have predicted. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happened next, and how a secret kept for nearly a century came to be broken in the strangest possible way. In 1784, 92 years after the sermon, the old meeting house at Wrentham Crossing was declared structurally unsound. A large new federal-style church had been built on the hill above the original site, and the congregation had decided to abandon the old oak timber structure that had stood for 123 years. The country was, by then, no longer a British colony. It had just emerged from a long war. The new minister, a young Yale-trained man named the Reverend Jabez Trowbridge, oversaw the demolition. Trowbridge was 29 years old and had never heard the story of the Night Discourse. The villagers of his time, the great-grandchildren of those who had sat in the meeting house that November, no longer told the story even to their own families. It had slipped, as so many village stories slip, into the category of the half-remembered, and from there into the category of the not quite believed, and from there into something indistinguishable from forgetting. During the removal of the pulpit, a workman's pick struck something metal beneath the floorboards. The iron box was uncovered. The last of the original elders, Caleb Merriweather, had died nearly 40 years earlier, and the key had been lost, if indeed it had ever been passed on to anyone. Reverend Trowbridge had the box pried open with a crowbar. Inside, wrapped in a waxed cloth, was the manuscript of the Night Discourse. Trowbridge read it over the course of 3 days. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a reader of Locke and Priestley, and he did not believe in devils or in judgments from buried medicine men, but he believed in what he called the dignity of the historical record. And he refused to destroy the document. Instead, he made a single handwritten copy, which he sent to Harvard College in the autumn of 1784, and he reburied the original with the demolished foundations of the meeting house. He did not tell anyone in the village what he had done. His cover letter to Harvard, which survives in the Houghton Library collection, described the sermon as a remarkable document of the Puritan mind in a moment of moral crisis, and made no reference to any deaths. He mentioned only that the sermon had been preached in November of 1692 by a minister named Harkwell, and that it concerned the spiritual consequences of violence against the native peoples. He suggested that future scholars of the colonial period might find it of interest. He requested that the manuscript be stored in the college library. Harvard received it, filed it, and in the manner of such institutions with such documents, forgot it. The Harvard copy of the sermon sat in the college library uncatalogued and essentially unread for most of the 19th century. It was rediscovered in 1887 by a young graduate student named Hollis Amberlin, who was researching the history of Puritan preaching for his doctoral dissertation. Amberlin was 24 years old, the son of a Unitarian minister from Worcester and a careful and scrupulous researcher. He read the sermon. He read it again. He then began to investigate the village of Wrentham Crossing, which by that date no longer existed under that name. The settlement had been absorbed into the town of Groveland sometime in the early 1800s. Its old boundary lines dissolving into the redrawn maps of a different era, and the site of the old meeting house had been covered over by a dairy pasture. Amberlin went to Groveland in the summer of 1888. He spent 3 weeks there, staying at a small inn on the main road. He interviewed the oldest residents, some of whom were in their 80s and had their own grandmother's stories to pass along. He found 3 elderly women who had heard from their grandmothers fragments of a story about a bad sermon, and 3 men who had died in a single night long ago. One of these women, a Mrs. Hattie Forbush, told him that her grandmother had been a small child in the village at the time and had been kept home that night by her mother, who had a bad feeling about the service. The grandmother had remembered hearing from her bed the sound of people running in the road outside sometime late in the evening, and had remembered her mother standing at the window for a long time in the dark without lighting a candle. Another of the women, a Mrs. Orpha Lindwell, told him that her grandmother had said only one thing about the sermon ever, and had said it on her deathbed. The grandmother had said that the minister had told the truth, and that telling the truth had cost them all more than they could afford. Mrs. Lindwell did not know what truth the minister had told nor who them was. Amberlin found in the records of the first parish of Groveland a single line for November the 12th, 1692, listing the burials of Silas Ruddock, Thomas Penhale, and Ebenezer Codrick on the same date. He found in the Essex County probate records the wills of all 3 men, probated within a week of each other, with identical handwriting in the certifying notations, suggesting that a single clerk had hurried through all 3 documents in a single sitting. He found in a farmhouse attic a small fragment of what he believed to be Reverend Harkwell's private journal, including the passage describing the figure in the woods. The fragment had survived because it had been used at some point in the mid-18th century as a stiffener in the spine of a homemade ledger book, a common frugality of the period, and had been preserved by accident when the ledger was broken up. Amberlin transcribed it carefully, and he found in a distant corner of the same dairy pasture that had once held the meeting house a low mound of stones that the local farmers they'd never plowed around, because every draft horse they had ever tried to bring to that spot had balked and refused. The farmer who owned the pasture, a practical man of 60-odd years, told Amberlin that he did not know why the horses refused. He said only that they had always refused, and that he had long since given up trying to understand them. Amberlin wrote up his findings in a monograph titled A Forgotten Sermon of the Salem Season, which he submitted for publication in the Proceedings of the American Antiquarian Society in 1889. The monograph was rejected. The reasons for the rejection are not recorded, but a private letter from the editor to Amberlin's dissertation advisor has been preserved. And in it, the editor wrote that the subject matter was, in his words, not suitable for a serious scholarly journal and would only encourage superstitious speculation in an age that needed no more of it. The editor advised that the young man be counseled to move on to more productive topics. The advisor complied. Amberlin put the monograph in a drawer. He finished his dissertation on a cipher topic, a study of the sermons of Solomon Stoddard. He took a teaching position at a small college in central Pennsylvania. He died of tuberculosis in 1893 at the age of 29 in the same town where he had been born. His papers, including the unpublished monograph, were donated to the Essex Historical Society by his mother, who believed that her son's research ought to be preserved somewhere, though she did not know where. The society accepted them. They were placed in a wooden filing cabinet in a storeroom. They remained there, uncatalogued, for another 60 years. The story was rediscovered a third time in the autumn of 1953. A local historian in Groveland, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Edna Carwick, was preparing a small book on the history of the town's early settlements. Miss Carwick was 68 years old, unmarried, and had taught fourth-grade history in the local elementary school for 42 years before her retirement. She was a methodical woman. She had a file cabinet of her own, and a system of colored index cards, and a habit of writing to strangers in distant archives with politely phrased questions that were impossible to ignore. She found the Amberlin papers at the Historical Society, read the monograph, and grew interested in the site of the old meeting house. She obtained permission from the family that owned the former dairy pasture, a farming couple named Borodowski, who had bought the land in the 1920s, to survey the land in October of that year. She hired a local man with a metal detector, a veteran of the recent Korean conflict, named Tim Overbeck, to sweep the area. Within an hour, they had located what appeared to be the iron corner braces of the old meeting house foundation. Overbeck offered to come back with shovels the following weekend. Miss Carwick thanked him and said that she would manage. She did not want a large excavation. She wanted only to confirm the location. In November of that same year, working alone on a cold and overcast afternoon, she returned to the site with a garden trowel and a small canvas bag. She began to dig by hand in the spot where the detector had registered most strongly. She found, about 18 and below the surface, the broken remains of the iron box. Most of the original manuscript had long since rotted. The pulping of wet paper over 169 years in the New England soil had reduced nearly all of the pages to illegibility. But a single folded sheet preserved by the waxed cloth that had once lined the box had survived. Written on it in Reverend Harkwell's hand was the list of 7 names. Miss Carwick took the list home. She placed it between 2 sheets of blotting paper inside a manila folder inside a drawer of her desk. She showed it to no one. She did not mention it in her book on the history of Groveland, which was published in 1955 and sold approximately 300 copies. She did, however, write about the list in a private diary that she kept intermittently throughout her retirement. The relevant entries, which were read for the first time by the archivist Vlachos in 2010, describe a gradual change in her daily life over the 3 months following the excavation. She wrote that she had begun to sleep poorly. She wrote that the house felt, in her own phrase, asymmetrical, as though one corner of it was slightly heavier than the others. She wrote that on the night of February the 14th, 1954, she had dreamed of a tall man in a gray coat standing at the foot of her bed, not pointing at her, but simply looking at her. And that in the dream she had understood, without being told, that he was not angry with her, but was merely waiting to see what she would do. She wrote that she had decided that morning to make no further inquiries. She would neither publish the list nor destroy it. She would simply let it sit in her desk. The dreams, she wrote, had stopped shortly afterward. They had not returned. She died in 1961 of heart failure in her sleep, in the same small house where she had lived for most of her adult life. She left her papers to the Essex Historical Society, where the list was catalogued along with her other materials. And then, through some bureaucratic oversight, misfiled in a folder labeled 1890s Correspondence. It remained there unread until 2008, when a young archivist named David Thoreau Vlachos, working on a digital cataloging project, opened the folder and found the list. Vlachos was a careful man. He was 27 years old at the time of the discovery. He had a master's degree in archival science from Simmons College and was working on a temporary contract funded by a small state grant. He had not set out to find anything extraordinary. His assignment had been the ordinary one of scanning and tagging loose correspondence in a collection that no one had looked at in half a century. He had opened the misfiled folder because it was the next folder in the row. He had seen the list because Miss Cowick's careful handwriting of 1953 had stood out immediately against the older hand of the 17th century paper beneath it. And he had known at once that something had been filed in the wrong century. He did not write a sensational article. He did not send the list to a journal. He did not post photographs of it on the internet. He did, however, note the names on the list. And he began, quietly and on his own time, to investigate what had happened to the 7 people named on it. He worked on this investigation for 6 years, entirely outside his official duties, using the Sundays and long holiday weekends that other young men his age were spending on other things. He became, in that time, an uncredentialed, but meticulous genealogist of the old Essex County families. He learned to read the handwriting of a dozen different parish clerks. He read microfilmed probate records until his eyes blurred. He traveled on his own money to small historical societies in Vermont and Maine. What he found, he eventually shared in a single private lecture at the Historical Society in 2014, attended by only 7 people. The lecture was not recorded. A 2-page summary exists in the Society's internal records. His findings were these. Abigail Ruddock lived until 1731. She never had children. She spent most of her adult life, according to parish records, in what her contemporaries called a state of persistent melancholy. She was buried in an unmarked grave at her own request. Her will, which survives, left her few possessions to her husband's nephew and contained a single cryptic instruction that nothing of hers should ever be interred in the ground of Wrentham Crossing, by which she meant the old village, which by then was already beginning to disappear into Groveland. Her grave is somewhere in the old burying ground of Newburyport, but its exact location has never been identified. The widow Prudence Dustin Oliver died in 1709. Her will, which survives, left her entire estate, a very small one, to the child Mercy Linscott with a single cryptic instruction that she was to plant no apple trees on any property she owned for the rest of her life. Mercy Linscott obeyed this instruction for the next 74 years. Her descendants, who can be traced through the Linscott and later Whitford families into the 19th century, continued to obey it for another 3 generations, according to a family memoir written in 1847 by a great-great-granddaughter who did not know why the prohibition existed, but had been told by her mother that it was not to be broken. The Reverend Josiah Harkwell, as has been said, disappeared into the woods north of the village in November of 1692. But Vlachos found, in a collection of late colonial French missionary correspondence, held at the Archives Nationales in Paris, a letter from 1696 written by a Jesuit priest working among the Abenaki in what is now southern Quebec. The priest, a Father Etienne Baudoin, described meeting an elderly English minister who had been living for nearly 4 years as a guest of a Pennacook band that had fled northward during the wars of the 1670s. The minister, the priest wrote, spoke tolerable French, good Latin, and was learning the Algonquian of the band with a patience the priest found admirable. The minister had told him a story that he, the priest, did not entirely believe, but that he set down in his letter because it troubled him, and he wished the record of it to exist somewhere. The story concerned a debt. The minister had told the priest that he had been sent a list of 7 names, and that he had understood, when he saw the list, that his own name was on it, not because he was guilty, but because he was the one who would carry the confession. He had preached the confession. He had watched 3 men die in its presence, and he had then come north, the priest wrote. because he believed he had been called to spend the remainder of his life among the descendants of those his own people had killed, until such time as his debt should also be considered paid. The minister had added, Father Baudoin recorded, that he believed the debt to be paid when the last of those who could remember the killing on either side had died. He estimated that this would take another generation. He intended to live long enough to see it. The priest noted that the minister was, at the time of their meeting, in excellent health and appeared to be at peace. He did not report the minister's death. No record of Harkwell's death has ever been found in any English, French, or mission archive. His name simply ceases around 1710 or 1712 from the fragmentary correspondence of the northern missions and is not heard again. The first three names on the list, Silas Ruddock, Thomas Penhallow, and Ebenezer Coytrick, had, of course, all died on the night of the sermon. But Vlachos, examining the list more carefully under magnification, noticed something that 90 years of previous readers, if any had ever read it, had missed. The list had not originally been written in one session. The first three names, the names of those who died, appeared to have been written in a slightly different ink from the fourth name, Harkwell's own, and the fifth, sixth, and seventh names, which had been assumed to be blank, were not blank at all. They had been written in a third kind of ink, much fainter, so faint that it was invisible under ordinary light, and had survived only because the waxed cloth had protected the page from the bleaching of sunlight and air. Under ultraviolet examination, which Vlachos arranged through a colleague at the Peabody Essex Museum, he was able to read the three remaining names. They were the names of the three men who had killed the Pennacook in 1663, and whose descendants had died on the night of the sermon: Jonas Ruddock, Obadiah Penhallow, Hezekiah Cotrick. The list was not a record of those who would die. It was a record of a ledger being closed. 7 names. 4 who would confess, 3 who had killed, and the fourth line, Harkwell's own, written between them as the one who would carry the accounting from the one side of the ledger to the other. When Vlachos finished his lecture in 2014, he showed his 7 listeners a final photograph. He had taken it the previous summer, at the site of the old meeting house, in what had once been the Groveland dairy pasture. The mound of stones that Hollis Amberlin had described in 1888 was still there. The Borodowskis had sold the farm decades earlier, and the current owner, a man named Alan Petersfield, had no particular interest in farming and had allowed the pasture to return to scrub and meadow. Vlachos had not disturbed the mound. He had only taken a photograph. But when he developed the photograph, he said he had noticed that at the edge of the mound, partially covered by moss, there was a flat stone, and on the flat stone, cut into its surface in shallow and weathered lines, were 7 marks arranged in a horizontal row. 3 marks on the left, 1 mark slightly larger in the center, 3 marks on the right. He did not know when the marks had been cut. He did not know who had cut them. He had asked Petersfield, who told him that, to his knowledge, no one had ever cut any marks on any stone on the property, and that the mound had been there since before his own grandfather had bought the land in 1911. Vlachos ended his lecture. He did not propose any interpretation. He said only that the story, as far as he could follow it, had ended, and that the ledger, as far as he could tell, had been closed. But there is one final detail that has been preserved in the record, and it is the reason that in certain circles the story of the Night Discourse of Wrentham Crossing is still told in whispers. In the spring of 2016, a real estate developer named Morgan Calvert purchased the former dairy pasture with plans to build a small subdivision of single-family homes. The survey for the development was carried out in April of that year. The surveyors noted the mound of stones and marked it for removal. Before the removal could be carried out, 3 of the workers on the project became seriously ill within a span of 11 days. None of the illnesses were fatal. 2 were cases of severe pneumonia, unusual for the time of year. 1 was a previously undiagnosed heart condition in a man of 43. The project was not delayed because of the illnesses. It was delayed because the developer, according to local reporting in the Haverhill Gazette, simply changed his mind. He sold the land to the town of Groveland for use as a small conservation parcel. Calvert himself, when asked by a local reporter why he had reversed the decision, gave a short answer that the reporter quoted in full. He said that he had walked the property one afternoon late in May alone, without his surveyors, and had stood for a while near the stone mound. He said he did not know what had happened to him there. He said only that he had felt, in his own words, like a man standing in a room that had been waiting a long time to be left alone. He did not elaborate. He retired from real estate development the following year. The mound was not disturbed. The marks on the flat stone, as far as anyone knows, are still there. And the descendants of the 7 families on the list, who have now scattered across the country over more than 3 centuries, have no particular reason to believe that the story has any bearing on their lives. The Ruddock name has largely vanished from New England, though a branch of the family established themselves in western Pennsylvania in an early 19th century, and their descendants are now scattered from Pittsburgh to the Pacific. The Penhallow line has faded to a single surviving surname in rural New Hampshire, though a number of the female descendants carry the bloodline under different married names across 3 states. The Cottrell descendants can be traced down to the 20th century, but then become difficult to follow. The usual consequence of daughters marrying and mothers dying and parish records being lost in fires. The Harkwell name, for what it is worth, seems to have died out entirely as the minister left no children that anyone knows of. And his only documented brother, a shipwright in Gloucester, lost his only son in an accident at sea in 1702, unless, of course, one of the listeners to this account is a Ruddock or a Penhallow or a Cottrell by some line of descent they have never traced, and feels, as they have perhaps always felt, an unexplained and quiet reluctance to ever plant an apple tree. This mystery shows us how the worst things done by a community can be buried for generations, not beneath the earth, but beneath the silence of the people who inherit the profits of the wrong. The Puritans of Wrentham Crossing believed they were hearing a sermon about witchcraft or demons or divine judgment. What they were actually hearing was the simplest and most terrible kind of confession, the kind where a man stands up in front of his neighbors and names, one by one, the debts that no one has ever wanted to pay. 3 men died that night, whether they died of shock or stress, or the unbearable weight of a truth that had been kept for 29 years. No one can say for certain. A modern physician reading the accounts of Silas Ruddock's collapse would likely diagnose a fatal arrhythmia brought on by acute emotional stress. A modern physician reading the account of Thomas Pennell would likely diagnose a burst stomach ulcer. A modern physician reading the account of Ebenezer Catrick might reach, with less certainty, for the diagnosis of cardiac arrest in a man already suffering from an undetected condition and pushed past the edge of his endurance by the panic of a long run in the cold. All of these diagnoses are plausible. All of them are, in a certain sense, sufficient. What they do not explain is why 3 men, on the same night, in the same room, at the moment of the same accusation, were all found at the edge of their endurance together. That is a question that medicine does not answer. It is a question that only history, and perhaps conscience can answer. What we can say is that the sermon was real. The list is real. The marks on the stone are real. And the silence that held the story shut for 3 centuries was real. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the 3 men died of natural causes, brought on by the shock of public accusation? Or do you think there is something more? Something older and quieter at work beneath the orchards and the stones of northern Essex County? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this one, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves the darker corners of American history. See you in the next video.